Most people hear the phrase tax the rich and immediately stop thinking. They hear billionaire tax, they hear wealth tax, they hear California, and then they tell themselves a comforting story. This has nothing to do with me. That is usually the moment when people become most vulnerable, because once a society accepts the mechanism, the threshold becomes a political detail. And political details have a habit of moving. That is what I want you to understand, not the slogan, the mechanism, because if you only focus on who is being targeted right now, you will miss what becomes possible later. That is how tax systems evolve. They do not begin by announcing that everyone will eventually be pulled in. They begin by selecting a group almost nobody wants to defend. Then the system gets built. Then the definitions get normalized. Then the thresholds become negotiable. That is the pattern. And if you think I am exaggerating, I want you to remember how income tax itself entered American life. The United States did not begin as a country built around a permanent federal income tax that came later. And when it came dressed in modest language and narrow application. It was sold as limited, temporary in spirit, if not in law, mostly for the rich, something ordinary people did not need to fear. History had other ideas. The problem with tax systems is not merely the rate. It is the precedent. Once the state proves it can tax a category successfully, that category stops feeling extraordinary. That is the danger. And that is why I think the California billionaire tax proposal matters, even for people who are not billionaires and do not live in California. Now let me be careful and precise, because precision matters here. The official California proposal now on the table is A1, times 5% tax on the net worth of California billionaires. And the legislative analyst's office states that real estate, pensions, and retirement accounts are excluded from the tax base. That point matters and should not be distorted. This is not, at this moment, a direct tax on ordinary homeowners' home equity. It is not written that way, but do not make the mistake of stopping there, because the current text is only part of the story. The larger story is that the language, architecture, and political imagination around taxing wealth itself are now much more developed than they were before. That is what should make you pay attention. A state is no longer merely debating whether to tax what you earn. It is debating whether government should, in principle, reach into accumulated net worth as a tax base. That is a different frontier. And once that frontier is crossed conceptually, the argument changes permanently. The question stops being, should wealth ever be taxed this way? The question becomes, at what threshold, how often, and with what exclusions? That is how systems expand, quietly at first, then all at once in hindsight. Now, I want to explain why this matters at a deeper level to tax wealth. Government needs more than a tax form. It needs a map of what you own, how it is valued, how often it is revalued, how easily it can be documented, how hard it is to hide, how politically defensible it is to include or exclude one category while keeping another. That is where this becomes more than a California story. It becomes a system story, because once the machinery for wealth taxation exists in one place, it becomes easier for other jurisdictions to copy, adapt, or expand. Not necessarily tomorrow, not necessarily cleanly, but politically the impossible becomes discussable. Then the discussable becomes ordinary. That is the real progression. Now, I am not saying the United States dollar collapses tomorrow, private property disappears tomorrow, or ordinary homeowners wake up next year to a federal tax on every dollar of home equity they built. I do not think that way. I am saying something more disciplined. I have you wait until a tax system already includes you before you start thinking about how tax systems evolve. You are late. That is the lesson. And California matters because California has a long history of functioning as a proving ground for ideas that later spread culturally, legally, or politically beyond its borders. Sometimes those ideas fail, sometimes they mutate, sometimes they come back in a softer wrapper. But the test itself matters. That is why I pay attention. Now, let us talk about why home equity gets pulled into this conversation emotionally, even when it is not explicitly inside this specific tax base, because home equity is where ordinary people store a huge portion of their wealth. It is visible, it is local, it is politically legible, and unlike many other forms of wealth, property is already subject to recurring assessment systems. That matters enormously. The state may not need to invent the basic concept of valuation from scratch where real estate is concerned. It already lives inside an ecosystem of assessors, parcel maps, title records, appraisal conventions, property tax rolls, and reassessment disputes. In other words, a great deal of the administrative skeleton already exists. That is why homeowners should never become complacent just because a specific proposal excludes real estate today. Exclusion is not immunity. Exclusion is simply the current boundary. And boundaries move when governments need money badly enough. That is one reason this whole topic becomes so important in places where political promises have outrun fiscal reality. Because once a state has made spending commitments it cannot comfortably support, the search for new tax bases becomes relentless. It rarely begins with broad honesty about cutting promises. It usually begins with a search for a smaller, politically vulnerable class that can be told it is uniquely able to absorb the burden. That is the old playbook. Find the group the majority will not defend. Call the tax fair, call it overdue, call it temporary, build the apparatus, then watch the definitions drift over time. That is how I think about it, not with panic, with pattern recognition. Now, let us be fair. There are also limits to how far these proposals can go. The wealthy are mobile, capital is mobile, businesses are mobile, domicile planning is real, asset protection is real, legal structuring is real. The rich do not sit still when governments become too hungry. That is one reason these taxes are harder to administer than they sound in campaign rhetoric. It is also one reason policymakers are often tempted eventually to move down market toward assets that are harder to move and easier to see. That is another reason ordinary homeowners should pay attention. A house is not mobile, a parcel is not mobile, a county record is not mobile, and if you are a government trying to stabilize revenue, the most attractive tax bases are often the ones that cannot run. That does not prove a home equity tax on ordinary families is coming. But it does explain why complacency is foolish. Now let me step back from California and say something broader. This is not only about tax law, it is about how you think about wealth itself. Too many people still think wealth is what they earn. It is not. Income is flow. Wealth is stored optionality. It is what lets you survive bad governments, bad policy, bad timing, bad inflation, bad rates, and bad surprises without becoming desperate. That is why protecting accumulated wealth matters so much. Not because money is everything, because vulnerability is expensive. And if the future tax environment becomes more experimental, more aggressive, or more willing to redefine what counts as a taxable base, then your job is not to become hysterical. Your job is to become deliberate. That means legal structure. That means entity hygiene. That means trust and LLC planning where appropriate. That means liquidity. That means not leaving every ounce of your net worth exposed in the most visible, least flexible form possible if you have reasonable alternatives. That means understanding debt not only as a risk, but sometimes as a strategic tool when used carefully against appreciating assets. That means geographic optionality. If your wealth grows large enough, that domicile actually matters. Most people hear conversations like this and want one dramatic answer: buy gold, leave California, go all in on Bitcoin, move everything into a trust. That is not how grown people should think. The correct response is layered. You diversify legal exposure, you diversify asset exposure, you diversify jurisdictional exposure. If your scale justifies it, you build resilience before you need it. That is the adult answer. Now, because people always want a simpler conclusion, let me give you one. The current California billionaire tax proposal does not directly tax ordinary home equity, and anyone saying otherwise too confidently is flattening the details too much. But if you think that means the broader issue is unimportant, you are missing the bigger lesson. The bigger lesson is that wealth itself is now a more legitimate political target than it used to be. That target is being normalized, and once normalized, it will be debated, revised, imitated, attacked, defended, and reshaped again and again. That is what matters, not just this proposal, the precedent of the proposal. Now ask the question that actually matters to you. If the tax debate in America gradually shifts from what you earn toward what you own, are you positioned well for that world? Are you overexposed to visible static assets? Are you legally organized or casually exposed? Are you holding enough optionality? Are you diversified enough across asset types that one policy idea cannot corner all of your wealth at once? Those are the serious questions, and I think most people are not asking them because the proposal still sounds like it is about somebody else. That is how the canary always works. At first, it is just a bird. At first, it is just one mine. At first, it is just a tax on somebody richer than you. And then one day, people realize the air has changed and they never prepared for what happens when the mechanism that seemed distant becomes politically ordinary. That is why I think this matters, not because I am certain of the exact path, because I can already see the category boundary being contested. And once category boundaries start moving, intelligent people stop arguing over whether the old world is definitely gone. They start preparing for the possibility that the new one will be more invasive, more creative, and less respectful of wealth than the last. That is not paranoia. That is prudence. And prudence, properly understood, is just what wealth looks like when it chooses to defend itself.